The wind didn't knock. It simply arrived with the force of a freight train made of ice, tearing through the valley at speeds that turned snowflakes into bullets. Within hours, what had been a quiet farmstead on the edge of Montana's Glacier County became a frozen graveyard of twisted metal and splintered wood. The barn collapsed first, its century-old beams snapping like matchsticks. Then the house, the shed, the chicken coop, everything above ground was erased, swallowed by a wall of white that meteorologists would later call the worst blizzard in 70 years. But 68-year-old Warren Begley wasn't in any of those structures. He was 20 feet below the surface, in a room that nobody believed should exist, listening to his entire world being destroyed above his head. And he was warm. If you're watching this because you believe in preparation, in trusting your instincts even when everyone calls you crazy, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button, because the stories we tell here aren't about luck. They're about the choices people make when they see what's coming and refuse to pretend everything will be fine. This is one of those stories. The following story is presented as a narrative reconstruction. Warren Begley had never been the kind of man who explained himself. Born in 1955 to a family of cattle ranchers, he'd learned early that the land didn't negotiate, weather didn't compromise, and words were cheaper than the breath it took to speak them. So when he started digging beneath his barn in the spring of 2021, he didn't hold a family meeting or post about it online. He simply backed his 1987 Ford pickup to the barn's east wall, unloaded a shovel, a pickaxe, and a wheelbarrow, and began moving earth. His daughter Michelle noticed first. She'd driven up from Kalispell with his 2 grandsons for a Sunday visit and found him emerging from the barn covered in dirt, his white hair plastered to his forehead with sweat despite the cool April air. "Dad, what are you doing?" she'd asked, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that adult children reserve for aging parents who might be losing their grip on reality. Warren had looked at her with those pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink as often as they should, and said simply, "Making a room." Then he'd walked past her to the pump, washed his hands and face, and asked the boys if they wanted to help him fix the fence in the south pasture. That was the entire explanation. Making a room, beneath a barn, 20 feet down. Michelle told her husband that night that her father had finally cracked. 70 years of isolation, of brutal winters and lonelier summers, had caught up with him. She called Warren's younger brother Robert, who still lived 3 hours east in Billings, and Robert promised to drive out and talk some sense into him. But when Robert arrived 2 weeks later, Warren was already 12 feet down, and the hole had begun to take shape. It wasn't just a hole, it was engineered. The walls were shored with timber Warren had cut and treated himself. The entrance was a reinforced shaft with a ladder he'd welded from steel pipe. At the bottom, the space was beginning to expand outward, following dimensions that clearly existed in Warren's head if nowhere else. "Warren, this is insane," Robert had said, standing at the edge of the excavation with his arms crossed. "You're 66 years old. You're going to give yourself a heart attack or bring the whole barn down on your head, or both." Warren had paused in his digging, leaning on the shovel. His back was screaming, his shoulders were knots of fire, and his hands were bleeding through the calluses, but his voice was steady. Might not. Either way, I'm making a room." "For what? What are you preparing for? The apocalypse? Nuclear war? What?" Warren had looked up at his brother through the shaft opening, a silhouette against the bright sky. "Winter," he'd said. Just that one word. Then he'd gone back to digging. The truth was that Warren Begley had been watching the weather patterns for 5 years. Not on the news, not on apps or websites, but the real weather. The way the birds migrated earlier each fall, the thickness of the wasps' nests, the behavior of the elk that came down from the high country. His grandfather had taught him to read these signs when Warren was barely tall enough to see over the pasture fence, and those lessons had never failed him. Something was coming. He didn't know if it would be this year or next, this decade or the following, but the signs all pointed to the same conclusion. A winter was approaching that would make the blizzard of 1949 look like a spring flurry. Nobody believed in signs anymore. They believed in Doppler radar and computer models and 7-day forecasts that were wrong as often as they were right. Warren didn't argue with them. He just kept digging. By June, Michelle had stopped visiting. The weekly phone calls became monthly, then stopped altogether. Robert sent an email suggesting that Warren talk to someone, a professional, someone who specialized in helping older people through difficult transitions. Warren deleted it without responding. His neighbors, the Hendersons, who owned the property to the south, started telling people in town that old man Begley had lost it, was digging his own grave out there, probably thought he was building a bunker for when the government came. The story spread through the small community of Cutbank with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. The crazy hermit on the North Road digging to China, waiting for the end of the world. Warren heard the stories when he made his monthly trip to town for supplies. He'd see the looks, hear the whispers that weren't quite quiet enough. He'd load his truck with timber, concrete mix, steel brackets, insulation, and canned goods, and he'd drive home without acknowledging any of it. Let them think what they wanted. He had work to do. The room took shape through the summer. 20 feet long, 15 feet wide, 8 feet high. Warren installed support columns made from telephone poles he'd acquired from the county when they upgraded the lines. He poured a concrete floor in sections, mixing each batch by hand, hauling it down the shaft one bucket at a time. His back screamed, his knees swelled. He lost 15 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. But the room grew. He ran ventilation using PVC pipe that extended up through the barn floor and out through the roof, disguised as a standard barn vent. He installed a wood-burning stove, a small one designed for heating boats with a chimney pipe that followed the same path as the ventilation. The stove was the hardest part. Getting it down the shaft required him to build a pulley system, and he nearly lost it twice, the weight swinging wildly as he lowered it inch by inch. But it made it. Everything made it. By August, when the first hints of autumn began to creep into the night air, Warren had moved on to the finishing work. He insulated the walls with foam board and covered them with plywood. He built shelves along one wall for storage. He installed LED lights powered by a marine battery that he could charge with a small solar panel on the barn roof. He brought down a narrow bed, a chair, a small table, and enough food to last 6 months. Beans, rice, flour, salt, sugar, coffee, canned vegetables, canned meat, dried fruit, water in 5-gallon jugs, 50 of them. Michelle came back in September. She'd heard from the Hendersons that her father had finished whatever project had consumed him, and curiosity had finally overcome her frustration. She found him in the barn, and he showed her. Led her down the shaft, down the ladder, into the room beneath the earth. She'd stood there in the LED light looking at the shelves of food, the stove, the bed, the small table with a kerosene lamp on it, and she'd started to cry. "Dad, this is not normal. This isn't what normal people do. You need help. Professional help." Warren had stood there, his hands in his pockets, and waited for her to finish. When she finally looked at him, her eyes red, he'd spoken quietly. "Your grandmother lived through the winter of '49. She was 8 years old. Her family lost everything. The livestock froze standing up. The house collapsed under the snow. They survived in the root cellar eating potatoes and drinking snowmelt for 11 weeks. 11 weeks, Michelle. She told me that story when I was your age. Made me promise I'd never be caught unprepared. I made a promise. Grandma died 20 years ago, Dad. The world is different now. We have warning systems, emergency services, snowplows. And when the power goes out, when the roads are buried under 20 feet of snow, when the temperature hits 40 below and stays there for a month, who comes then?" She'd left without answering. Warren had stayed in the room for a while after she'd gone, sitting in the chair listening to the silence. The earth around him was cool and still. No wind, no voices, just the solid presence of tons of soil and rock holding back the world above. October came, and with it the first snow. Just a dusting, nothing unusual for Montana in the fall. But Warren watched the sky and felt the wind and knew. Soon, he started spending his nights in the room, coming up only during the day to tend to the last of his chores. He butchered the chickens and canned the meat. He cut a final load of firewood and stacked it in the barn. He filled the water jugs one last time. On November 3rd, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours. The wind shifted to the northeast. Warren saw the elk, 12 of them, running south across his property at a dead sprint. Not grazing, not walking, running. He climbed down the shaft, pulled the hatch closed behind him and locked it from the inside. The storm hit 36 hours later. The first indication that something was wrong came not as sound, but as its absence. Warren had been reading by lamplight, an old paperback western he'd read a dozen times before when he realized he could no longer hear the wind. For 2 days, the storm had been a constant presence even 20 feet underground, a low vibration that traveled through the earth itself, a pressure that made his ears pop, a sense of movement in the world above. And then, suddenly, nothing. The silence was so complete it felt like a physical weight. Warren set down his book and listened. Silence in nature is never truly silent. There's always something. The skirtle of mice, the settling of wood, the whisper of air moving through spaces. But this was different. This was the silence of burial, of being sealed away from everything that lived and breathed and moved. He stood up from his chair, his knees protesting after hours of sitting, and moved to the ladder. His hand touched the lowest rung, and he felt it. Cold. The metal was cold in a way it hadn't been before, a deep cold that went beyond the temperature of the underground room. He climbed. The hatch at the top of the shaft should have opened easily. Warren had oiled the hinges himself, tested it 100 times. But when he pushed, nothing happened. He braced his feet on the ladder and pushed harder, putting his shoulder into it. The hatch didn't budge. Not even a fraction of an inch. It wasn't stuck. It was weighted down, pressed down by something so heavy that his full strength couldn't move it at all. Warren descended the ladder slowly, methodically, and returned to his chair. He sat down and forced himself to think. The barn was above the hatch. If the barn had collapsed, the debris would be on top of the hatch. Timber, metal roofing, equipment, the weight of all of it would be more than enough to trap him. But the barn was a sturdy structure, built in 1923, weathered through nearly a century of Montana winters. It would take something extraordinary to bring it down. He thought about the silence, about the complete absence of wind noise, about the cold seeping down through the shaft. And he understood. The barn was gone. Not just damaged. Gone. And on top of where it had been, on top of where the hatch was, there was snow. Not inches, not feet. Tons of it. A weight so massive that it had crushed everything in its path and now sat like a mountain over his only exit. Warren Begley had prepared for many scenarios. He had food, water, heat, light. He had books, tools, a first aid kit, and enough supplies to last through the worst winter he could imagine. What he had not prepared for was being unable to leave. The ventilation shaft was 4 inches in diameter. The stove chimney was 6. Neither was large enough for a man to climb through, and both extended up through what was now an unknown depth of compacted snow and debris. He was sealed in. Entombed in the room he'd built to save his life. For the first time since he'd started digging, Warren felt afraid. He spent that first day after the silence fell in a state of forced calm, taking inventory with the methodical precision of a man who knows that panic is a luxury he cannot afford. The food stores were exactly as he'd calculated. 6 months of supplies if he rationed carefully. The water jugs were full. 50 of them, 5 gallons each. 250 gallons. Enough for 8 months if he was conservative. The wood for the stove was the problem. He had enough split logs to last perhaps 6 weeks if he burned constantly. But if he needed to conserve, if he needed to stretch the heat through a longer period, he'd have to burn less. And in a room 20 feet below frozen ground, with no other source of warmth, cold would be his enemy. The ventilation worried him most. The shaft was designed to pull fresh air down and allow smoke and carbon dioxide to escape up through the stove chimney. But if both were blocked by snow and debris, the system wouldn't function. He'd suffocate long before he starved. Warren tested it by lighting the stove with a small amount of kindling. The smoke rose as it should, disappearing up the chimney pipe. After an hour, the air in the room still felt fresh. The system was working. Somehow, despite everything above, air was still moving. The ventilation shaft must have remained partially clear, or perhaps the debris pile was porous enough to allow gas exchange. It was the first piece of good news he'd had. Warren established a routine because routine was survival. He woke at what he estimated was dawn, though in the underground room there was no way to tell day from night except by his watch. He ate a small breakfast. Oatmeal with raisins and a spoonful of sugar. Coffee, black, 1 cup. He read for 2 hours, exercised for 1 hour, pushing against the concrete walls, doing squats and lunges in the limited space. Lunch was crackers and canned meat, or beans and rice. More reading, more exercise. Dinner was the largest meal, usually something he could heat on the stove. Soup, stew, chili. He allowed himself to burn the stove for 3 hours each evening, enough to cook and to warm the room before sleep. The rest of the time, he wore layers, thermal underwear, wool shirts, a heavy jacket. He slept under 3 blankets. The solitude didn't bother him. Warren had lived alone for most of his adult life. His wife had died in 1998, a sudden aneurysm that took her while she was hanging laundry on the line. One moment she was there, the next she was gone. They'd had 32 years together, most of them good, and he'd never seen the point in finding someone else. He'd had his daughter, his grandkids for a while, his work. That had been enough. And then as the years passed and Michelle grew distant and the grandkids became teenagers with lives that didn't include an old man on a remote farm, even that had faded. So the silence of the underground room was just another kind of silence. No worse than the silence of the house above had been. But there was a difference, he discovered, between chosen solitude and forced isolation. In the house, he could step outside whenever he wanted, walk to the barn, drive to town, see the sky. Down here there was only the room, 20 feet by 15 feet, 4 walls, a ceiling, a floor. The LED lights gave off a harsh white glow that made everything look flat and unreal. The kerosene lamp was better, warmer, but he had to conserve the fuel. So he sat in the LED light and read his books and tried not to think about the weight above him. The psychological pressure built slowly, like water rising behind a dam. At first it was just an awareness, a background hum of unease, but as days passed it grew. Warren would catch himself staring at the ladder, at the closed hatch at its top, imagining what was beyond. Was it snow? Debris? Both? How deep was it? 10 feet? 20? 50? Was the sun still shining up there? Or was the storm still raging? Had anyone noticed he was missing? Michelle hadn't called in months. Robert wouldn't think to check. The Hendersons probably assumed he'd driven south for the winter like sensible people did. It was possible that no one knew. No one was looking. No one would look until spring, if then. He dreamed about being buried alive. Not metaphorically buried, not trapped in the room, but actually buried, lying in a coffin while dirt was shoveled on top of him. He'd wake gasping, his heart hammering, the darkness of the room absolute because he'd turned off the lights to save the battery. In those moments, the panic was real and sharp. He'd fumble for the lamp, light it with shaking hands and sit there breathing, forcing air in and out until the terror subsided. On what he calculated was the 15th day, Warren heard something that wasn't silence, a crack, sharp and loud like a gunshot. It came from above, from somewhere in the earth between the room and the surface. He froze, listening. Another crack, then a groan of stressed wood. Something was shifting. The weight above was settling, compressing, finding new equilibrium. The sounds continued intermittently for hours. Each one made Warren flinch. Each one raised the possibility that the support columns would fail, that the ceiling would come down, that the room would collapse into itself and crush him in an instant. But the columns held. The ceiling held. The room, built with the same stubborn thoroughness that Warren had applied to everything in his life, did what it was designed to do. It held back the weight. The sounds eventually stopped and the silence returned. Warren marked the days by making small cuts in one of the wooden support columns with his pocket knife. 1 cut per day. He didn't trust his watch entirely, didn't trust his sense of time in the eternal sameness of the underground. The physical marks were real, undeniable. After 3 weeks, there were 21 cuts. After 4 weeks, 28. He was thinner now. His clothes hung loose. The rationing was working, but it meant being hungry all the time, a constant low-level gnawing that never quite went away. He thought about food constantly. Not the canned beans and rice he was eating, but real food. Steak, potatoes with butter, fresh bread, his wife's apple pie. The thoughts were torture, but they were also company. Memories of meals became memories of the people he'd shared them with, and for a while, he wasn't alone. If you've made it this far in the story, if Warren's determination is resonating with you, take a second to leave a comment. Tell me what you would do in his situation. Would you stay calm like Warren, or would the walls start closing in? The comments section is where this community comes alive, where we share not just reactions but wisdom. So don't just watch. Participate. Your perspective matters. The cold was getting worse. Warren had been conservative with the firewood, burning it only in the evenings, but even with his careful rationing, the supply was running low. He calculated that he had perhaps 2 more weeks of fuel. After that, there would be no heat at all. The stove kept the room tolerable, bringing the temperature up to maybe 50 degrees during the burn time. Without it, the temperature would drop to match the earth around him. 40 degrees at best. At worst, if the frost line penetrated this deep, it could go lower. He'd survive probably, but survival in constant cold was its own kind of hell. On the 33rd day, Warren made a decision. He would try to dig out. Not through the hatch, that was impossible, but the ventilation shaft. It was only 4 inches in diameter, but if he could widen it, if he could excavate around it, he might be able to create a passage wide enough to crawl through. It would take time. It would take all his remaining strength. But the alternative was to sit and wait and hope, and Warren Begley had never been a man who hoped when he could act. He started with tools he had, a small folding shovel from his supplies, a knife, his hands. The ventilation shaft was PVC pipe, and where it entered the room's ceiling, it was held in place by a wooden frame. Warren began there, prying away the frame, loosening the pipe. The work was awkward. He had to stand on the table to reach the ceiling, his arms above his head, every muscle straining. The pipe resisted. It had been installed firmly, sealed, meant to last. But Warren was patient. He worked at it for hours, taking breaks when his arms gave out, then returning. Finally, the pipe shifted, moved, came loose. Warren pulled the PVC pipe down section by section, each piece revealing compacted snow above. The ventilation shaft had indeed remained partially open, but only barely. Snow had invaded the pipe, freezing solid in some sections, creating an icy plug that extended upward into darkness. He cleared what he could reach, using the knife to chip away at the ice, but after 3 feet, the shaft curved slightly, following the path he'd designed to prevent direct downdrafts. He couldn't see beyond the curve, couldn't know how far up the blockage extended. The excavation around the shaft was slow, brutal work. Warren used the folding shovel to scrape at the earth beside where the pipe had been, widening the hole inch by inch. The soil here was different from what he'd dug through during construction. It was frozen now, hard as concrete, mixed with ice crystals that glittered in the LED light. Each shovelful required multiple strikes, the impact jarring his shoulders, sending pain down his spine. He worked in 30-minute shifts, resting between them, his breath coming in ragged gasps. After 2 days of digging, he'd widened the hole to perhaps 8 inches in diameter and extended it upward by 4 feet. His hands were bleeding again, the old calluses cracked and raw. His shoulders screamed with every movement. But he could see progress, could see the shaft extending up into the frozen earth, and that was enough to keep him going. On the third day of excavation, the shovel hit something that wasn't earth. Metal. Warren cleared around it carefully, expecting a rock, finding instead a twisted piece of corrugated roofing. Barn roof. He was through the soil layer and into the debris field. The discovery was both encouraging and devastating. Encouraging because it meant he was close to the surface. Devastating because if the barn debris was this deep, the snow above it must be deeper still. He kept digging, moving the metal aside, finding wood beneath it, splintered beams, some as thick as his thigh, frozen together in a compressed mass. The barn hadn't just collapsed. It had been pulverized, shattered by a force so tremendous that century-old timber had snapped like kindling. Warren worked around the larger pieces, creating a narrow tunnel that snaked upward between obstacles. The space was barely wide enough for his shoulders. If he got stuck, there would be no way back. The food was running low now. Warren had stretched his supplies as far as they would go. But 2 months underground had depleted stores he'd calculated would last 6. The extra physical work of digging, the calories burned in constant shivering, had accelerated everything. He was eating once a day now, a thin soup made from beans and the last of the canned vegetables. His body was consuming itself, burning muscle for fuel. When he looked at his hands in the lamplight, they seemed skeletal, the bones prominent under skin that had grown loose and papery. The tunnel extended upward. 8 feet now, 10 feet, 12. Warren lost track of time completely, existing in a cycle of dig, rest, dig, rest. His world had narrowed to the circle of frozen earth in front of his face, the next shovelful, the next inch of progress. He no longer marked days on the support column. There was only the tunnel. At 15 feet he hit snow. Real snow, not the frost-contaminated soil, but actual accumulated snowfall compressed into ice. It was so densely packed that the shovel bounced off it. Warren switched to the knife, chipping away fragments, his fingers numb despite the gloves. The ice extended upward as far as he could reach. He was inside the storm's deposit now, inside the thing that had buried his farm and everything on it. The air in the tunnel was different, thinner. The ventilation from below couldn't reach this high, and his breathing created condensation that froze on the tunnel walls. Each breath was an effort. Warren knew the signs of oxygen deprivation, had learned them from a mining accident pamphlet decades ago. Confusion, euphoria, unconsciousness, death. He worked faster, driven by fear now as much as determination. 20 feet up, the tunnel collapsed. Not dramatically, not with warning. Warren was chipping at the ice when the walls simply gave way, the frozen earth sliding down around him, filling the space, burying him to the chest in seconds. He couldn't move his arms, couldn't breathe. The weight was immense, crushing. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in the room below, not in comfort, but here, stuck in a hole in the ground, suffocating in darkness. But Warren Begley had not survived 68 years of Montana winters by giving up when things got hard. He forced himself to stop struggling, to go still, to think. His left arm was pinned, but his right had some movement. He could flex his fingers, bend his wrist slightly. He worked it back and forth, creating tiny spaces in the packed earth, widening them gradually. Minutes passed, hours maybe. Time had no meaning. There was only the movement, the fraction of an inch gained, then another fraction. His right arm came free to the elbow, then to the shoulder. He could reach his face now, clear the dirt from his mouth and nose, breathe. The rest took longer. He used his free arm to excavate around his chest, pushing the soil down into the tunnel below, creating space. When he could expand his lungs fully, he worked on his left arm, then his waist, then his legs. When he finally pulled himself free, climbing back down to the room 20 feet below, he collapsed on the floor and lay there shaking. He didn't go back up for 2 days, didn't have the strength, didn't have the will. He lay on the bed under the blankets and stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was how it would end. Not in a dramatic rescue, not in triumph, but in simple exhaustion. The body giving out, the will finally breaking. On what might have been the 70th day, Warren woke to a sound. Not silence, not the crack of settling earth, but something else. A drip. Steady, rhythmic, insistent. Water was falling somewhere in the room. He lit the lamp and searched, finding the source at the base of the tunnel shaft. Meltwater, dripping down from above, pooling on the concrete floor. It meant only one thing. The temperature was rising. Spring was coming. Warren returned to the tunnel with renewed purpose. The collapse had actually helped, creating a wider space that was easier to work in. The ice above was softer now, weeping water as it thawed. He dug through it faster, the knife sinking in where before it had only chipped. 2 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet. The meltwater soaked him, freezing on his clothes, but he didn't stop. At what he estimated was 28 feet from the room floor, the knife broke through into open air. Not daylight, not yet, but air that moved, that carried the smell of pine and wet earth instead of the stale underground scent he'd been breathing for months. Warren enlarged the hole, his hands moving frantically now, widening it enough to fit his head through. He pushed up, breaking through the final crust of ice and snow, and saw sky. Gray sky. Overcast, but sky. Real sky, infinite and open and impossible. Warren pulled himself out of the tunnel, emerging into a world transformed. Where his barn had been, there was nothing. Where his house had stood, there was a mound of snow-covered debris. The landscape was white in every direction, broken only by the dark shapes of distant mountains. Everything was gone. Everything except him. He stood there in waist-deep snow, his body wrecked, his clothes frozen to his skin, and he laughed. Not from joy, not from relief, but from the sheer absurdity of it. He'd been right. He'd prepared. He'd survived. And the world had ended anyway, had been scraped clean and buried, and all his preparation had bought him was this: the privilege of standing alone in the ruins, the last man in a dead world. Then he heard it. Distant, but distinct. The sound of an engine. Warren turned, squinting against the bright whiteness, and saw it. A snowmobile, orange and black, cutting across the landscape from the south. Behind it, another, and another. A convoy. Search and rescue finally venturing into the isolated areas now that the weather had broken. They found him standing there, a skeletal figure in frozen clothes, and at first they thought he was a corpse. Then Warren raised his hand in greeting, and the lead driver nearly crashed his machine from shock. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, loaded him onto a sled, and began asking questions he was too tired to answer. Later, in the hospital in Great Falls, Michelle would sit by his bed and cry and apologize and tell him she should have believed. Robert would visit and stare at him like he was seeing a ghost, which in a way he was. The news would run the story, calling him the miracle survivor, the man who predicted the unpredictable and lived when hundreds hadn't. They'd want to know how he knew, what signs he'd seen, what warnings he'd heeded. But Warren never told them about the birds or the wasps or his grandmother's stories. He simply said he'd gotten lucky, had built a storm shelter that happened to save his life. Let them think it was luck. Let them believe whatever made them comfortable. He knew the truth. Survival wasn't about luck. It was about seeing what was coming, preparing for it, and refusing to quit even when the entire world was collapsing around you. It was about trusting yourself when everyone else called you crazy. It was about digging, every day, even when your body screamed and your mind begged you to stop. Warren Begley was released from the hospital 3 weeks later. Michelle wanted him to move to Kalispell, to live near her, to never be alone again. But Warren had already made other plans. The farm was gone, yes, the structures were destroyed, but the land remained. And 20 feet below where his barn had been, there was a room. A room that had held back the weight of the worst winter in 70 years. A room that had saved his life. He was going to rebuild. Not because he had to. Because he wanted to. Because that's what you did. You survived. And then you built again. And you prepared for whatever came next. The storm had taken everything above ground, but what he'd built beneath had been enough. It had been exactly enough.